Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Several people passed along to me a story that they saw in the news they knew I'd be interested in. And coronavirus claims Larry Rathgeb, 50 years after he oversaw the first closed-circuit 200-mile-per-hour lap. And what we're talking about is Larry worked for Chrysler. And he worked for Chrysler back in the days when they were trying to beat Ford on the tracks of NASCAR. And to do it, they did this. They put a nose cone and a wing in a car. They sold them to the public to make them street legal and then raced them in NASCAR where they were fast. And it's a fascinating story. I've written quite a bit about it. I interviewed Larry a couple times. I've got some photographs that I took last time I saw him, which was at a winged car event about 6 years ago. And he's a great guy, brilliant guy, friendly guy. And what's interesting is I interviewed him a couple times, and on one occasion, he actually invited me over to his house, and I was in his living room, and he was just telling me stories and showing me cool stuff, going back to his times with Mopar and the racing and all that. But it's an amazing story, what he accomplished, and some of the people he worked with at a great time in automotive history, especially in America. Daniel Stroll wrote the article for Hemmings about this. And he points out that 50 years ago to the day, Rathgeb had brought a bunch of engineers and what was basically the fastest stock car on the planet to Talladega. And there, Buddy Baker was given the job of driving the car to see how fast he could get it going. And here's the deal. Up until that moment in time, NASCAR had never certified, or USAC, or none of these organizations that do this, speed trial type of stuff. Nobody had ever certified a closed course 200-mile-an-hour lap with a stock-bodied car. So Chrysler approved this project and said, okay, take it down there and see what happens. And they created a cover story saying that they're testing transmissions or tires or something, but they just happened to have a timing crew there. And so they did this and sent Buddy Baker out there. And Rathgeb started his career as an engineer with Chrysler, and by the mid-1960s rose to become the lead of engineering for the racing development in the company. In that role, he not only worked with teams running Chrysler products and stock car racing, but, and here's a quote, Rathgeb even lived with a K&K racing team for a period of time, sleeping in a trailer out behind Hyde's shop in Charlotte. That's according to Steve Lehto's Dodge Daytona and Plymouth Superbird Design, Development, Production, and Competition, a book, which I happen to have right here, because I wrote it. It turns out that quote is true. And Harry Hyde, of course, was the crew chief for Bobby Isaac. And Chrysler would actually give these guys not just help with parts, but help with expertise. And so Larry Rathgeb would spend time at Richard Petty's shop and at Bobby Isaac's place and help them do stuff and try to get the cars to go faster in an attempt to make Chrysler look better on the tracks. And of course, he had a huge part in developing the Dodge Charger Daytona and the Plymouth Superbird. I mentioned before a guy named John Pointer, who was an aerodynamicist who had worked with Chrysler. And the guy had worked with missiles, the Chrysler missile division, before he worked in the automotive division. And so Larry and John Pointer had worked together on this. They had slightly different backgrounds. Larry Rathgeb, besides just working with Chrysler, at one point in time, believe it or not, worked in the motor pool for General MacArthur. I was talking to him, and he's casually mentioning these things. I'm like, wait a second. That's like a whole story right there. No, wait, that's a whole story right there. I mean, it's the guy had an amazing life. Again, back to Daniel Stroll. Any one of those Daytonas would have defined Rathgeb's career at Chrysler, but one in particular ended up his crowning achievement. It was the Mule. And I've got a whole section on that in my book. Basically, what happened was they had sent a Charger 500 out to California for magazines to test, and it got stolen by somebody, people unknown, and the recovered car got shipped back to Chrysler, and Chrysler's like, well, we can't, what are we going to do with this? I mean, we can't sell it. And so they shipped it to Nichols Engineering and had Nichols Engineering turn it into the similar structure they used on the stock cars. And then they sent it to Chrysler's test people and said, we're just going to use this as a test car, a test mule. And they started experimenting with it. It was right around this time that John Pointer said, hey, let's put a nose cone and a wing on a car. And so they shipped this car out to the Chelsea Proving Grounds where Pointer and his guys mocked up the car, and that became this particular car. So then Rathgeb in turn used it to test fit the bodywork changes that Pointer and Bob Marcel, who is another aerodynamics guy, these modifications would make the Daytona out of the Charger 500. Now, there's a couple things in this article that I disagree with. According to this, they got the car doing 240 miles per hour at Chelsea, which never happened. But it's one of those legends that's out there, so it's kind of hard to stomp on. So at that point, there was a lot of problems in NASCAR because there's a professional drivers association. The drivers had gotten together and formed a union. And they didn't think the Talladega track was safe. It had just been opened, and it had some issues with how rough it was in the corners and how fast these cars were going. They were all pushing 198, 197 miles an hour. And it was unclear if this track was safe for cars at those speeds. And so the PDA, the Professional Drivers Association, decided to boycott the race. And a bunch of the other drivers who weren't members or who were lesser drivers said, hey, we'll race. We don't care. It's a race. And Bobby Isaac hadn't been asked to join the PDA, so he raced. So, strange enough, the race was run by a guy named Richard Brickhouse driving at Daytona. But briefly, Chrysler wanted to see how good the mule would do, so they actually had the mule entered into the race, and they pretended it was privately owned. And the mule got qualified by Glotzback at 199 miles per hour. And there was a bit of a controversy because the factories were not supposed to be involved that directly in stock car racing, but everyone knew they were. Poorly kept secret. And so when Glotzback was down there pushing 200 and pushing it kind of hard, Larry Rathgeb was actually worried he might lose his job. And he didn't want to do that because he loved working for Chrysler. And so apparently he had a discussion with his boss over that weekend. And his boss said, look, dude, we want to win races. We don't care, okay? So, everyone pretty much knew that NASCAR wasn't going to do much if they, quote-unquote, got caught or outed. But not many people knew that the car that had been entered in the race was actually owned by Chrysler. So the car didn't wind up running. Another story altogether. But so after that season, 1969 season, 1970, they raced a full season with the Wings along with the Superbirds and the Plymouths and so on. And that, of course, will be the Richard Petty car down here. And at the end of the 1970 season, they decided, we're gonna kill the wing cars, and they got rid of them by rule. But the thing about it is that there was a time when somebody wondered, what could one of these cars do if we actually just put it on a track, tuned it perfectly? How fast would it go? And so they took the one down to Talladega, and they actually ran it, and it took them a little while. It was a cold day in March, which is good, by the way. I'm pretty sure the guys in the audience who understand engines will tell you that cold air is generally good. Don't have to worry about the engine heating as much, overheating, and also the cold air is better for the appetite of the engine, if you know what I mean. So they tweaked it a bunch. I've got some pictures of them doing that. If I can dig them up, I'll put them on screen. And they managed to run a lap that was documented at 200.447 miles per hour. 200.447. So that was a first, and that was a great moment in automotive history. And Larry Rathgeb was one of the guys instrumental in that. And in some of the pictures I'm going to be able to post, I think, here, Larry Rathgeb is one of the guys standing outside the car. Buddy Baker's driving it. Larry Rathgeb is there, and there's a bunch of other people from the industry, guys, I think, from Goodyear, that kind of thing. So it was a fascinating moment in time. But for those of you who are curious, one of the reasons that the 240 mile per hour thing doesn't make any sense is that in 1971, Bobby Isaac and the K&K guys took their Daytona out to Bonneville Salt Flats. And this is all documented and so on. And they did a flying mile where they literally have a start line and a stop line that are a mile apart with timers. And you could go back as far as you wanted to and get a running start. And they did a running start flying mile at 216 miles an hour. 216 miles an hour. And there's no question that the 216 mile an hour run that they did in the flying mile was about as fast as you could get that car to go. Now, to suggest that they beat that by 24 miles per hour a year earlier at Chelsea doesn't make much sense because it's the identical body. It's pretty much the same engine. And again, I don't want to get into a lot of aerodynamics and engineering stuff here because I'm neither an aerodynamicist nor an engineer. But the resistance that you encounter aerodynamically starts going up exponentially at higher speeds. And although these cars are highly aerodynamic, to tweak another 15 miles an hour out of it or another 25 miles an hour out of it is insanity. And so everyone I spoke to said that at Chelsea they got him around 200. I know that there's a book that says that Buddy Baker was quoted as saying he did 235. But I asked people who worked there, and they said if that happened, we didn't hear about it at the time, number one. And number two, the car didn't have a speedometer on it. So the only way you calculate the speed was to either have someone outside marking it with something or doing a stopwatch kind of thing. Or theoretically, if the tachometer had been that accurate, you could probably do it based on gear ratios and stuff. But it didn't happen. It didn't happen. So there's a lot of that kind of legendary, mythical stuff floating around out there that's simply not true. But I don't want to focus on that because I want to get back to the fact that Larry Rathgeb was the guy who was in charge of this program. And at one point in time, he had his bosses saying, hey, look, we're going to either yank our support for NASCAR or we're going to figure out a way to win. But we're sick and tired of just sitting around like this, without getting good results. And Larry Rathgeb then went to his guys and started asking around. And John Pointer's one of the guys he talked to, a couple other guys he talked to, who said, well, if you're willing to go out on a limb, put a nose cone and a wing on the car, we can get the equivalent of more horsepower. But by going aerodynamics, it's 6 of one, half dozen the other. Who cares where the mileage comes from? But we'll get the car faster. And Larry Rathgeb, think about this. He had to go to his boss and say, my guys have told me that we can build a car that looks like that. And we can sell them to the public, which will make them stock, and the cars will win in NASCAR. And he had to go in with a straight face and say that. And you have to understand that in corporate America, the idea that you're going to go to your boss with a harebrained idea like that is insanity. Most people who have a good job at a corporation where they've been for a few years and they can be there till they retire if they want to, keep their heads down and I'm just going to do my job. And Larry Rathgeb actually stood up, walked down the hallway, walked into that guy's office and goes, I've got some guys, got a kind of crazy idea, and I think it'll work. And they tell me it'll work, and I believe them. And his boss said, if it'll win, do it. I love the guy. So he passed away, and I talked to him at a winged car convention. I saw him. I actually interviewed him and talked to him for a little while. And it was a several day event. So I sat down and interviewed him one day. And the very next day, the event moved to a museum parking lot in Alabama to the Wellborn Muscle Car Museum. And there were a lot of guys there with winged cars. And I saw Larry walking around just talking to people. And I walked up and said hello to him again and thanked him for talking to me before and reminded him that he'd spoken to me years earlier in his living room. And, the number of stories he told me about, he used to travel basically on the NASCAR circuit, keeping in touch with all these guys like Bobby Isaac and Richard Petty and Buddy Baker and Charlie Glotzback and the whole gang from back in the day. And somewhere along the line, he discovered that Bobby Isaac liked to shoot the shotgun, shoot. And so they actually, somewhere along the line, got a skeet thrower. And they had it mounted on the roof of one of the trucks. And I forgot if it was a parts truck from Chrysler, but it was a truck. And he was telling me the story, and he said, oh, I can show it. And he went upstairs and he showed me this thing, and it said Larry's toy on it. It was a skeet thrower. What do you recall the thing that throws skeet? And he said that him and Bobby Isaac were just sitting out there in the infield. And I forgot what track they were at, but he was, we're sitting out in the infield, just pull. pull. And I was just thinking about that, going, again, getting back to a job at corporate America. Most people picture the guy with the white shirt and the pocket protector maybe and thick glasses and tie, bland tie. And, you go sit in a cubicle someplace with a slide rule maybe and crunch some numbers. And, hey, we figured out how to save a third of a penny on this one process. And this guy, his job is no. Go follow around these race teams. Give them advice on how to make their cars go faster. And in your downtime, you can sit in the infield and shoot skeet with Bobby Isaac or Richard Petty or Buddy Baker, or whoever else wants to sit around and blast stuff out of the sky with you. So I've got in the book a couple of those stories. In fact, I got a lot of those stories that I got from Larry. And then, for instance, the actual car itself, the 200 mile per hour mule, has been recovered. And again, I got a whole chapter on that. And a guy named Greg Kwiatkowski owns it. And he's restoring it right now back into the condition it was in when it did the 200 mile an hour lap. And among the people who went out to the garage to look at it with him when he first got his hands on it, I've got a photograph here, and there's John Pointer in the photograph along with Larry Rathgeb and a couple other guys from back in the day, all standing around this car going, yeah, I remember this car. That's the car we took out for the transmission tests to do 200 miles an hour. So again, it's very sad to announce, but Larry Rathgeb has passed away. Apparently he was about 90 years old. And, I had the opportunity to speak to him 3 or 4 times, but face-to-face interviews a couple times. Gentleman, a pioneer, very, very smart guy. And like I said, just to have the guts, corporate America, to make that walk down the hallway and tell your boss that you want to build these cars and sell them to the public so you can race them. You got to salute the guy. So it's with that, I tell you that he's passed away. I'm sorry to hear it. And otherwise, Godspeed. Questions or comments? Put them below. Otherwise, talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law. Good is better than bad, 'cause it's nicer.